Okay, I have 10 o'clock in Eastern time, so welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for our next webinar, our Discover Greif webinar series. My name is Cheryl Cottle. I'm responsible for marketing and communications at Greif, and I'll be your host for today's event. I can tell by the numbers, this is definitely a very popular webinar topic. We've done this about every 6 months for the last couple of years. So thank you for joining. As the supply chain uncertainty continues, our goal is to keep you informed, and so you can better manage the implications for your organization and better plan. And with that, we've got our global supply chain is here. They're joining us today to give you an update on various raw materials, as well as components and chemicals and everything that's affecting our pricing situation. We've also got Roy McAdoo, who is Vice President of Sales for our Global Industrial Packaging Division, joining us. They'll all introduce themselves as they begin to speak. We are on Zoom, and we do encourage you to submit your questions via the chat button. You'll find that at the bottom of your screen, so feel free to do that at any point during the presentation, and we'll entertain those at the end of the deck. Wanted to let you know that our agenda here is to give you kind of global and regional views on the various raw material components: steel, resin, old corrugated, so OCC, some of the other miscellaneous components, chemicals and energy, as well as logistics. But if you have any specific production related inquiries, we, something that's specific to your account, we'll address those offline. At that point, you feel free, you'll have an opportunity at the end to let us know you want someone to contact you from Greif, so feel free to let us know. We'll definitely reach out to you because we want to make sure that we do address those, but this is a topic to talk more globally and more broadly about the situation. We will be recording the webinar to share with those who are unable to attend, so you'll see that the recording has been turned on. And at that point, I'd like to turn it over to Francesco to get us started.
Hi, thank you. Thanks, Cheryl. Just for introduction, my name is Francesco Caforio. I joined Greif 10 years ago. I have more than 30 years experience in sourcing of commodities, I would say. Speaking about the supply chain situation, I would say is the very short message for you is in terms of supply and demand, situation is improving. I would say we had a period very difficult before the COVID. I would say now the situation we are living has been very complicated the last months. But I would say today what we see situation is improving. I would say overall is not only steel, is not only resin, but we see in all the commodities we source today situation is better. On the other hand, we still have very difficult situation. All of you know exactly what I'm speaking about. Situation of energy is high, is rising, and it looks like will not stop, meaning that the expectation, everyone believes that situation will continue to be very tight and very, I would say, difficult in terms of pricing. The other point that is very strongly, I would say, impacted, that continue to impact the supply chain is the situation on the transportation. About transportation, we continue to have a very difficult situation for driver shortage and for capacity, I would say, everywhere. And then we have this situation of port congestion. The situation in, I speak about two ports. One is Shanghai, the other is Houston. Situation has been very, very difficult. This has impacted significantly, not only this port and not only our delivery, but the overall global situation of ocean freight, that is situation. What has been the responses of the team, the responses of Greif? Clearly, we've improved the collaboration, communication, not only internally, but too externally with our supplier looking for together solution. Clearly, we have applied a strategy that is a buffering strategy, I would say increasing our stock to be sure that we can deliver where we see the risk, I would say, from our side. And then clearly speaking about transportation, we have really engaged proactively, meaning that we try to take solution when we see situation becomes difficult, try to find solution in advance, really working with this sense of urgency to solve the issue. because this has been the biggest issue, I would say, for us in this period. That's all for the introduction.
So if we move to the steel sourcing, good morning, first of all. Good afternoon. My name is Christina Zeitz. I joined Greif 10 years ago, and I have about 25 years of experience in steel sourcing and sales. And I had the global steel sourcing at Greif. On the first slide, we start with some numbers first. Crude steel production in 2021 reached 1.952 million tons. This is an increase of 3.83%, which is pretty high. 2019, it was 2.62%. 2020, it was flat. In 2021, the recovery from the pandemic shock turned out to be stronger than what was expected in many regions, even with the continuous supply chain issues that Francesco already mentioned and the COVID waves that we faced. However, the deceleration of the activity in China was sharper than anticipated, and it led to a lower global growth of demand and, in consequence, of the production. The production has been increased mainly in Europe and the Americas. You see here 15%, 18% in these regions. India is also up by 18%. China, however, declined by 3%. If you look back in 2020, I told you that China increased production by roughly 5%. I think it was more or less the only one that was able to increase production in 2020. But China is, of course, still by far the top one steel producing country, with a share of, I think 2020 it was 56% of global production, in 2021 down to 52.9%. So still more than half of global production. But let me remind you, they also consume a similar share, 52% of global production. World Steel just published the statistics through April this year, 22, and so far we see a decline of production by roughly 7% in average, with the largest decline in Russia, Ukraine, of course, and Asia. But this always compares to the previous year, so it compares to the high increases of 2021. As of now, sufficient material is available, even with supply chain interruptions that persist, one, due to the COVID waves, and two, due to the conflict in Ukraine. On the next page, we come to the different regions. We start with North America. And if I added a heading to the slides and the next one, I would say panic phase ended as the supply gaps are resolved. When the conflict began in Ukraine, the whole market dropped into shock with a fear of lack of basically everything you need for steel. Energy, coal, iron ore, scrap, slabs, all products that you do buy a lot in this region. Even in the US, that is less dependent from supplies out of Russia or Ukraine, the fear was tremendous. Supply chains were interrupted and prices rose by hundreds of dollars. But then the trade flows adjusted and also demand was lower than expected. After we reached the peak of the prices in the second half of April, they started to decline again. And while demand appears to be steady in the US, capacity utilization is about 80%. The inventories have been rising. This is due to the fact that the stocks have been filled in expectation of a higher demand, and this brings supply into a surplus. On the other side, raw material costs are high. Increased energy and commodity prices are felt globally, especially raw materials for steel production. Iron ore rose 16% last month, coal 39%. And these high steel prices paired with the high inflation that we have since 2021 With the recovery of the economy from the pandemic, demand increased, but at the same time, we suffered a huge shortage and disruptions of the international supply chain, plus shortage of manpower. So these were troubling the global steel industry even before the conflict and still continue. Regarding import duties, the US government has lifted the Section 232 duties on Ukrainian steel for a one-year period. This is supposed to support one of the critical industries of Ukraine, but it will likely not cause a significant change in the trade flows. I looked at the statistics. Ukraine, if you look at the ranking of steel importers to the US, Ukraine ranks number 28 with half a percent of imports last year. And there are issues to bring material in at all from Ukraine or out of Ukraine at all. I don't think there will be a real impact resulting from this. On the next page, we have a look at Europe, where the conflict obviously had a major impact on prices for a period of time. Market participants, again, adjusted their global trade flows, and they were able to cover the requirements outside of Russia and Ukraine. The European steel prices spiked when the conflict started, but a similar price surge was, for obvious reason, not seen in Asia, so the traditional import region of Europe. And this opened quite a huge interregional price gap that was too large to sustain. So once the initial panic buying phases ended in Europe, the buyers realized that they had options outside of Russia and Ukraine to replace the volumes that were absent through imports mainly, and even in the domestic market. So in consequence, the European domestic mills have been forced to lower their prices to secure sales, and the index published yesterday proves the consequences. Today, there is some weakness in the market in Europe. The industries suffer, such as automotive. The shortage of semiconductors persists and will still be there for a while. And the conflict in Ukraine is likely to delay any return to the normal supply chain in Europe. And similar to the US as well, the inflation of more than 8% dampens the demand and pushes up the prices. The magnitude of the impact of the conflict is different across the regions, of course. They depend on the direct trade and the financial exposure to Russia and Ukraine, but obviously there is a major impact on the European community because of its reliance on Russian energy and on the geographic proximity to the conflict area. Together with rent and transportation, specifically electricity, gas, fuel have a share of 45% in the consumer basket, so it really has a huge impact on the inflation. Price of electricity has been rising strongly for some time now, already before the war, and with the beginning of the conflict, the prices of gas, fuel, oil, petrol increased significantly. A force that supports the prices in Europe are the import quotas and duties. The European Community extended the safeguard quotas and the 25% duties by another year. And the steel mills have to pay CO2 surcharges since last year. Basically, I will give you some more information on that in a moment. And also a carbon border adjustment mechanism is supposed to be introduced, but this week the European Community decided to delay the decision. Probably, it's an expectation, by 2 months. Anyhow, import volumes remain restricted and there is a risk to it. Now let's move to APEC. In China, biggest market, of course, China has been affected by lockdowns as the zero COVID policy continues. Lockdowns continued in Shanghai and a number of other places around China as well disrupting logistics, choking consumption. These restrictions drastically slowed down logistics. Drivers were required to show test results everywhere they went. Passes were required for vehicles to move around at all. Steel demand has been pretty flat as the government tries to boost infrastructure and stabilize the real estate market specifically. But I read last week a mill official reported that steel inventories was at least 15% higher than usual due to the failure to deliver shipments in time to their customers. In April, the manufacturing purchasing index fell by 2% to 47.4% in April, making the second month of negative growth. And this is also the lowest since March 2020. 20, not 21. Chinese automotive production declined 46.3% in April, and home appliances 20%. So a huge impact, specifically due to the lockdowns. And they also impacted exports deliveries. There have been massive port congestions, as already mentioned, non-availability of vessels. And for all these reasons, the appetite for Chinese material has been limited. Looking back half a year, domestic prices in China have been very stable. Southeast Asia is more impacted by global market developments. Since Europe and the US settled after the conflict began and production is better aligned with the demand, Far East finds now far less support from the export markets, and it has been forced to cut their prices. Not to the level as in US and Europe, but both directions, it did not increase that much and it did not decline that much. And there is a but here as well. India introduced export duties. Iron ore is charged with 45-50% of export duties, and cold rolled coils with 15%, 1.5. And this stopped any further price cuts from India and Far East, so that the gap that we had between import and domestic pricing in Europe is now more or less closed. Last not least, Latin America on the next slide. Although steel demand in automotive, construction, agriculture and energy is healthy, there is a lot of uncertainty in this region, mainly because of the macroeconomic situation. Latin America is hit by one inflation after the other. This is caused both by COVID and by the Russian conflict as well. There are a lot of imports from APEC and Russia traditionally. But material availability on the other side is increasing. Ternium is ramping up a new rolling mill in Mexico. Imports are limited, restricted, even in some of the countries. In Brazil, you could say that Brazil benefited from the shortage of raw materials and slabs, specifically from Ukraine. They were covered widely from Brazil. Prices followed the global trends. So the upwards momentum for the Brazilian slab and sheet prices was halted in May, and price declined since then due to the weaker demand and better balanced inventories as of today. At the end of May, the Brazilian government announced it would again decrease the duties for most imported products, including steel sheets. There was a reduction already in November last year by 10%, and now they announced another 10%, so that import duties will be at 9.6% for the rest of the year. The objective is obviously to mitigate the effects of the pandemic and the conflict on the Brazilian economy. But you have to keep in mind, in the same time frame, other costs and freights of imports increased drastically. Before I come to my last slide, I have prepared one slide I would like to show you about the ETS, the emission trading system in Europe. This is the initiative for the energy-intensive industry in Europe that was launched in 2005 by the European Community to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050 and 55% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. This is the system initiated in the European Community, and the UK adapted basically the same after Brexit. You might be aware that under this ETS, every steel mill in Europe has a free allowance for their CO2 emissions, and any exceeding emissions have to be purchased on the energy market. The free allowances are gradually reduced every year to stimulate developments of green steel, and they will phase out completely. Today, the free allowances cover, in average, 70 to 80%. It depends, obviously, on the production, how much CO2 emissions are produced. But average is between 70 and 80%. So that the shortfall today, obviously, is up to 30%, and this has to be purchased. The steel mills have to buy allowances on the market and pay for them. At the current price of the allowances, the graph you see at the bottom, it's a cost about 50 euro per ton that steel mills started to charge separately to their customers last year, mid of last year. And MEPS also confirmed in their publication that both energy and CO2 surcharges, the two items that suppliers started to initiate last year, are excluded in the steel price indices. And if you remember that I mentioned on the slide for Europe that the revision of the ETS is ongoing to phase out the free allowances by 2030, you should be aware that here we are talking about substantial costs for, let me call it, traditional steel production. So if the cost is 50 euro per ton for a 30% shortfall, without free allowances, and with unchanged energy costs, of course, that would correspond to a cost of 160 euro per ton. If you look here at the graph and you wonder why it's 160 euro, the price is slightly above 80 euro. We were close to 100 euro a few weeks ago, and you produce about 1.85 tons of CO2 for 1 ton of steel. So if the shortfall is 30%, you have to multiply by 1.85. So the future is in green steel. We already have some solutions available that our sales force is available to give you detailed information on. But I want to make you aware that there is certainly at the moment a declining price in Europe, but there are increasing costs that will not allow prices to decline to levels we had a few years ago, or even 1.5 years ago. And also for other regions that we are presenting here, this is an initiative that exists today in Europe and in the UK, but additionally a carbon border adjustment mechanism is being discussed. So a CO2 surcharge basically for imports coming into Europe, and other regions will follow with similar initiatives too. So this is something that really needs to be kept in mind. On the last page, my outlook for 2022 and 2023, which I would say is highly uncertain. The expectation of a continued and stable recovery from pandemic has been shaken by the conflict in Ukraine. Inflation is rising everywhere, basically. And the steel market has moved out of the panic phase that followed the start of the conflict. So prices have been falling since then. Global supply gaps from Russia and Ukraine, which really seemed dramatic when we talked about it in March, have been filled through a combination of other supply sources. Inventory drawdowns, demand delays, and destruction of demand comes on top. But this was also an expected move in the market. A deficit cannot be sustained. There will be always ways to deal with it. And the speed at which it happened now has been a surprise. But in reality, prices are starting to be comparable now to the level we had before the conflict started. And there is not a general expectation that it will drop much more. Consumer spending was always likely to slow from the post-COVID boom, but the surging inflation pushed the adjustment to happen faster, as many people are cutting spendings at the cost of living really increased dramatically, and this is hurting steel demand in consumer-facing applications, home appliances. Production costs will remain high and can support the steel prices. Raw material costs, including notably coking coal, as you've seen in the first slide, with almost 40%, are expected to remain high. Energy costs are expected to remain high. Historical levels we have seen in logistics, there is no indication that we will see a dramatic decline. Duties and CO2 surcharges are coming on top, and costs for greener steel as well, research and development, new installations. So even if the conflict in Ukraine will come to an end, we hope so, the sanctions on Russia will likely remain. Under the current conditions, we expect relative stability in the months to go through the summer. For September ongoing, the future is very difficult to predict, given the ongoing COVID issues in China, the conflict in Ukraine, energy, logistic challenges. But there is not an expectation of drops, anything like we had in the past. Thank you for listening. I will now hand it over to my colleague Gianluca for an update on Resin. Thank you very much.
Hello, thanks Francesco, thanks Cristina. Good morning, good afternoon everyone. For the ones that didn't meet me last time, my name is Gianluca Valente. I have more than 15 years experience in leading global raw material sourcing for chemicals and agricultural derivatives. Joined Greif about 3 years ago, and I'm now leading the global sourcing of resins and chemicals. It's a great pleasure being here today again and trying to give you a flavor on what's going on the chemical market. Well, I mean, last time we spoke in December, we were wondering if after the last 2 crazy years that we saw in 2020 and 2021 for the chemical production due to COVID, severe storm in the US, a lot of force majeure, etc., this 2022 would have brought some stability. But unfortunately, as you know pretty well, this was not the case, at least till during the first half of this year, because once again, the industry had to manage extreme volatility, high degree of uncertainty. We have been again in a very challenging environment with very tight supply, with exceptional logistic constraints impacting global trade flow. And I mean, I recall you that the commodities, the chemicals are highly intertraded on global scale. So price skyrocketing, reaching all-time highs for feedstocks, and I mean a stronger than expected demand. So we have been, and we are still, I would say, in an environment that, I mean, even the veterans have never seen in the last 30 years. So what's next? I mean, short-term market balance is expected now to turn a little bit more balanced. The energy and the feedstock prices within EMEA, but also on global scale, are expecting to remain on historical high level till the end of 2022. The demand, as I said, was exceptionally good in this first half of the year, mainly driven from food and packaging sector. Now it's expected to stabilize or to get a little bit weaker over the rest of the year. But I mean, what is gonna stay is certainly the supply chain bottlenecks. I mean, these exceptional logistic constraints that we have seen that generated also frequent delays and order cancellations within our supply chain. The uncertainty also and the volatility are expected to be there, as we have seen, especially on the feedstock side, on gas and on the oil. So in terms of overall outlook, we expect, I mean, a slower economic environment on the back of what we mentioned already, what Cristina said, the soaring inflation and energy prices that are going to impact the consumer confidence and the spending. But I mean, the regional prices for EMEA, as I said, are expected to remain elevated. So even potential price correction due to the easing of the supply and the weaker demand can be offset from those supply chain bottlenecks. So that's a bit, I mean, the picture that I I'm now seeing for EMEA. Regarding North America, it's not going to be so different, to be honest. So following the last year repeated and exceptional capacity constraints, the domestic production now has stabilized. And I mean, there are still some pocket of tightness related to shortages in monomer additives and some other chemicals. Francesco will tell us more, for example, about acetyls that we buy for our PPS, but polymers are on a more better situation, I would say, from supply demand standpoint. The demand for US was exceptionally good till April, May. Record high level sales has been registered in April, and is expected to remain also pretty healthy till the end of the year, even if off peak, I would say. There is some additional polyethylene capacity coming on stream from Shell, from Nova, that should also easy and feather the supply, and should also allow to the US players to export more raw materials that has been now capped from the logistic constraint. So despite this shifting supply demand dynamics, the elevated energy prices are expected to be there also for US and to be a strong floor for pricing. So the regional prices we expect to remain elevated versus the historical one, and this trend is expected also to persist, as I said, till the end of the year. So let's have a look to the final region, to APAC. APAC on global scale this year has been, I would say, the most stable, the most calm, at least since the beginning of 2022, on the back of the dual control policy implementation from the government, and then the lockdown that we have seen basically till this last week, that impacted the production and the demand over there, but also clearly they had some impact on global scale. There's also new capacity coming on stream there in China that will add some pressure on the market. But the buying activities, I would say, also in this case, are expected to be constrained from an overall weaker demand. And the market also is not expected to take off very soon and should remain quite calm, I would say, quite bearish over the next months. Regional prices also, they already didn't have great, I mean, up and down movements like we saw in US and in North America, so are expected to remain quite flat without significant variations over the rest of 2022. So that's all from my side. With that, I thank you so much again, and I pass it to John.
Thanks very much, Gianluca. Good day, everyone. This is the first time we've covered OCC, and so I'll start with a few definitions on the next slide. OCC stands for Old Corrugated Containers. So my name is John Grinnell. I represent the recycling business, which is part of PPS. OCC is the principal raw material that we use to support all of the products that we produce within PPS. So we produce paperboard, and we convert that paperboard into tubes and cores and corrugated sheets, as well as send it to other converters in a range of end uses for production of recycled paper-based products. As a business, we consume ourselves about 2 million annual short tons of old corrugated containers, and we manage, as a recycling business, close to 4 million annual tons. And so what I'd like to do is give you a sense of sort of what are the factors that influence this market, and then sort of what does that mean going forward. But we'll have to, it's the first time we've covered it, so I'll do a brief little history lesson in terms of the shape this market has taken since COVID, with many of the same forces that others have already described. So the key factors that influence the pricing for OCC, first are the supply, and that's really simply the amount of corrugated material, post-use corrugated material that's available for collection in the market. And so I say available for collection, meaning not all of it actually gets collected. You know, we as consumers probably don't always get every piece of corrugated we have in our household into the right bin, recycling versus waste bin. And certainly that's true. There's other factors that prevent collection. So that's what's out there, and that's driven by the amount of imports in corrugated boxes, as well as the amount of corrugated that's produced within the US. The second factor is recovery, and that's really about what we're able to recover, what we're able to collect, and that's influenced by economics, it's influenced by the availability of recycling programs, and it's influenced by where that corrugated is being consumed. The third is domestic demand. CB is containerboard, the principal end-use application for OCC, the largest end market, but there are others. And so the amount of containerboard that is being produced is a key driver of demand. And similarly, export. Corrugated is a significant export. OCC, the US exports more than 10 million tons annually of OCC. So it is a big factor in the end demand. Most of that going to Southeast Asia for use in producing that containerboard that ends up coming back here in boxes. And then finally, input costs, which has been well covered already. We all see what's going on, particularly transportation, a critical factor. So what has this done to the market as we've gone through the post-COVID period? So let me explain the graph on the left. What this does, there is a published index. I'm not sharing the values of the index here, but I'll show you directionally how it's changed that governs OCC. And from February 2020, we came in with OCC pricing being somewhere in the $30, $40, $50 a ton range, very low. And what this is showing you, the time periods of the change, and then the degree of the change from that baseline entry period. So we start with the first sort of cycle, the COVID lockdowns we all went through in April and May of 2020. What happened there? What were the forces at play? Well, they were first demand. First the demand in terms of continued demand from containerboard mills to produce essential goods and services, but supply eroding because of the shutdowns. And so a lot of the places we collect material are commercial generators, offices, institutional locations, big box retail stores, all of those were under shutdown. And so immediately following COVID, supply was deeply challenging. The other thing that happened was recovery. There were the collectors, the recycling companies. There were uncertainties of how COVID was transmitted. So it was very difficult to get your hands. And so we saw a massive price shock, a tripling of price. Immediately following that, as people figured out how to start working and figured out how they were going to live with COVID, we saw a period B there of demand erosion, where most of that price increase came back out. And through the summer of that period, we saw a return to much lower OCC prices. That was largely driven by the shock to demand. A lot of unemployment, the stimulus really hadn't kicked in yet, so people weren't spending. And away from home applications like tissue that consume OCC were dead. We're just not functioning because the markets has eroded. So seemed like the market had normalized, but in fact, with the impact of stimulus, Part C, we saw a massive influx of demand. Consumers shifted their spending from services to goods. Imports boomed, and we saw dramatic expansion of and really a boom in the containerboard market and most recycled paper markets. So that shot prices way back up again and reached historic highs. That lasted through September 21, and since then we've seen sort of a very gradual, slow moderation until this past month when we reached a plateau that was driven by recovery of supply. As we saw some of the places where recycling programs had been shut down come back, we saw labor conditions improve somewhat. So those recycling companies that simply could not sort material were able to bring labor into the facilities to do it, and a moderation of price. So it's those factors, the supply, the recovery, demand, and input costs that are going to drive the future. So we asked, obviously, where are we going from here? And I'll try and address those as we move on, right? So I'll look at each of those. The first is supply, and what you see in the upper right, that's containerboard production in millions of short tons. Again, our paper packaging business is a US or North America centric business, so we speak in short tons. But you see what we went through from 20 to 21 was a historic spike in production capacity as new mills came in. And what's unique about our market is what the supply and the demand are driven by the very same things, right? Because our product is a circular market. So what we produce ends up being the raw material for what we're going to becomes the raw material again for what we will produce next time. So we saw a significant increase in that supply, and we also saw a significant increase in imports of goods. So you would think, hey, with an expanding supply situation, that ought to provide price pressure downwards. But as you look at recovery, so recovery determines what actually becomes viable supply. It's what's gotten away from where that waste is generated and manages to make it back into the system. So we saw a fundamental change due to COVID, and that's what you see at the bottom right? It's that we saw a collection from commercial locations. So again, think about a large retailer. we all moved to buying from the home, right? We're all relying on Amazon and delivery services. We saw about 15% of the market move from of the material move from being, ending its life in a commercial location to ending its life in a residence. And the collection rate there, in fact, the U.S. still had through this period some large cities where there were no recycling programs in place because of the depressed costs or prices for OCC leading in, before we came into COVID, just making them economically not viable. So the collection rate of that 6 million tons that moved, about 50% of that just disappeared from the market. It was no longer available supply because it wasn't being collected. So fundamentally, from a recovery point of view, what we saw is that this shift that probably we won't ever go back from. So when we look forward from a recovery point of view, what we'll expect is gradual progress, right? We're seeing improved technology in the sortation systems that allow us to capture more, a little bit better labor conditions there, and then the resumption, because of these high prices for OCC, of some of those collection programs that had gone away. So it will improve, but this shift from commercial to residential, I don't think everybody's going back to the office every day anytime soon, and similarly back to the store, some of those changes will persist. And we'll move on and look at the other two factors. And so those are domestic demand and exports. So the demand side of this. We saw earlier that the supply expanded because of new capacity for containerboard. Well, that same thing becomes demand, right? So we saw 2 million tons as marked by the dark green dots on this map. These are new mills producing containerboard from recycled material, or conversions from what were virgin or other types of paperboard mills into recycled containerboard. And what we see looking forward is there's still another 2 million tons coming online. So that same level of jump we saw from 20 to 21, we'll see as we get through 2023. So natively, there is that demand pressure that will continue to be in the market, and particularly will be, anywhere in a geographic circle around one of those stars. That's going to be a sensitive market, and will have sort of local influence to it. We also see non-containerboard applications for OCC growing. So there's things in the demand picture, again, absent the very biggest factor, which is the macro, is consumer spending. If consumer spending collapses, we go into recession, then this demand, it will be demand that doesn't have a home, but we don't see that today. And then finally, exports. So exports, again, a big part of the market. Everybody thought China's ban on imported OCC would have a huge impact on the market. It had a very temporary impact as pulp makers located in other places in Southeast Asia and replaced that demand. And while we talk, and very realistically so, about all of the challenges in exporting due to supply chain, my unfinished sentence there, despite this, is we actually saw an increase in exports of OCC over the last 2 years. So despite those challenges, and even looking forward, US OCC, because of the amount of virgin paperboard we still have, is the highest quality OCC, and the logistics, the landed cost to get to Asia is cheaper out of the US, so it will continue to be a favored source. There's likely to continue to be pressure coming from that export market to buoy the US market. So I'll go on to the final picture of where do we think this goes. So in the short term, well, first, let me explain on the right. So this is the sort of total picture of what's happened over the last 2 years. We saw increase in supply. That's the same thing as our increase in consumption, new mills producing paper, 4 million. We also saw about 2 million tons of increase in imports. And then we saw that recovery shift, that recovery stuff going to the residents that didn't get captured. So this is sort of back of the envelope or approximate math. The bottom line is the increase in supply was less than the increase in demand. And that's why we're not anytime soon headed back to a market where corrugated's between 30 or OCC is between $30 and $50. In the short term, the summertime is the slowest period of generation of material. It will be tight. It's 5-8% below normal times. So we wouldn't expect pricing pressure relief in the short term. In the long term, improving technology of collection, improving economics of collection, returning municipal programs, and then hopefully easing of inflation and some recovery to pre-COVID norms all are things that could cause some longer term reductions in OCC costs. The biggest factor, of course, is just macroeconomics and consumption, and that's uncertain at best. And so your guess is as good as mine on that one. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Francesco. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Let me give an update on, I would say, different items, but that somehow you will see that the message will not be so different. Are different market, different components, very important for us because at the end, each of these material permit to us to produce drums, I would say to produce everything. Without that, we'll have the same issue as we don't have raw material. Let me start from the ABC. General message on the ABC components is valid for plastic, is valid too for the steel components, is that these the last months have been very difficult. The capacity has been very tight, but to the substrate has been really an issue to have, say, with a lot of problems. And with this problem, we had two problems of the cost, because you know the energy has a significant impact. Let me say it's not only energy, it's the overall inflation that has impacted the overall production cost. It has impacted the current market environment, I would say. From our side, for sure, what we tried during the last years, I would say, and we are trying to do is, for sure, to reduce the risk and to secure the capacity, to secure the product. I would say this is done in with different action. I would say with new asset, new molds, with, I would say, new supplier, meaning that is really we have been taking a lot of action just to increase our capacity of production, reduce our risk. These are for the all IBC components. Moving to the closing rings for, you know, is a part of the steel drums is very important. The market has been very tight. Has been very tight for, I would say, is the same exactly for as the IBC components. The overall capacity has been very tight, and the substrate that is used, is galvanized steel, was very difficult, I would say, to find. There was not a lot of material available. Situation for sure today is, as I said at the beginning, situation is improving. That is good. Now, saying that, I have to say that in terms of pricing, for a lot of reasons, we don't see really sign of reduction. Why I say this? Because it's true, the steel market, we see some sign of stabilization, but on the other hand, for producing closing rings, you have energy, you have labor cost, you have components that come, I would say, through overseas, meaning that all these things push for higher price, meaning that what we see in the market of the closing rings is for sure a better situation in terms of availability, but in terms of price, we do not expect today I would say decrease. We see the market very strong, very stable. Moving to paints and linings, I would say similar comment. Clearly, we speak about oil. We speak a lot of shortage for everything concerning resin, pigments, which I would say the results of this has been very difficult period, market very tight. I would say a strong price increase that clearly you could not, I would say, discuss. For sure, the expectation is that the situation we expect will improve, is already start improving. Somehow in terms of price, clearly we speak about oil, we don't see price reducing. We see the price will for sure remain under pressure. Again, moving to the following categories, the gasket. Again, the situation is extreme price volatility during the first part of the year, very limited availability. Is good for us that we have really a global footprint, permitting really to, I would say, to control our supply chain. This has been really key for us, not to avoid any disruption. I would say for the moment, we don't see change expected in the short, medium term. Market is very tight. We are still linked to the overall oil market. It's a very difficult market. Then moving to other categories that are the chemicals, but somehow linked to the things we have presented until now. Speaking about the vinyl acetate monomer, I guarantee this period has been probably the most difficult period I have seen in the last 10 years on the vinyl acetate. To be clear, in the last period, we have been in the three big suppliers, these Celanese, Dow, and Basel, that have declared force majeure. They are still in force majeure. The situation, I would say, is now, the good message is that the situation now is improving. What has been good for us is that our relationship with the supplier are very long-term relationship. We have contractual relationship, we have partnership relationship. This has permitted really to our facility to continue to run, I would say. But for sure, the situation has been very critical. Now they are coming out from the force majeure, situation is improving. Clearly, I don't speak about pricing. Situation on pricing is tight. We do not expect this situation will improve. We expect the price will continue to be very high and not to be reduced. Some very short word about starches. You know, situation who for you is in this market. You know, situation about the corn starches. We have a lot of issue, I would say, in this period. For sure, the overall supply chain team is working to have not only new supplier, but to use two alternative substrate. I would say just to use other starches, not only deriving from corn, but deriving from pea, from potato, and so on. The last category I just want to give you an update is the wooden pallet. You know, the wooden pallet has been very, very tight mark in the last months. Situation is, we have seen improvements in May. We have seen the overall situation of stock is improving. What we have seen, a very volatile market. Price has been continued to rise during the first half of the year for several reasons. It's not only, you know, the question about speaking about EMEA has been impacted by Ukraine, not only for the wood, but just give an idea why I speak about the substrate is not only the wood, but to the nails that are used for the pallets in Europe comes mostly from Ukraine, creating the needs to find other way to have these nails, I would say. But at the end, the message has been market very tight. Situation is today more stable. That is not only in terms of price, but in terms of availability. For sure, the expectation is not that the market will go down, because specifically speaking about the overall pallet situation and the origin of the wood will impact globally our the wooden pallets. We expect the market will continue to be very tight, and even if we see more stabilization, we expect the market will restart or will continue to go up in the future. That's all on my side.
Thank you, Francesco. So quickly, I'm Myron Graumsbacher, been with Greif for a little over 18 years and have responsibility for our North America indirect goods and services sourcing and supply chain. We've touched on energy quite a bit throughout, and we wanted to highlight specifically the natural gas and electric power in EMEA and North America. For sake of time, I will quickly hit a few key points, and then we'll jump to the transportation and logistics. But clearly, markets have experienced both in EMEA and North America, and you can see the trends, significant upward trends, record-breaking volatility. The past 8 to 12 months, so even prior to the conflict, we were seeing rising prices due to a number of factors, both technical from the trader perspective, but also from various regulations such as the CO2 emissions and deficit in the storage amounts. So again, similar trends, but two totally different markets. And naturally, the Russia-Ukraine conflict has definitely caused more volatility as well and more uncertainty. We have continued to see increases of imports of LNG going from the US to EMEA. There's about 12 BCF that go per day. And by 2025, we're looking to, the US looks to increase capacity to about 18 BCF. So again, that will help in the longer term. And you can see that reflected in the charts. The high prices is over the next 6 to 9 months. Then the lower curves are the 2023, 2024, 2025. We did suffer that just yesterday, and to highlight the volatility that we see, we've seen prices go $1.50, $2 a day change. Yesterday in North America, prices went from 15% down on the day as a result of the Freeport LNG export facility having a fire and explosion last week. And it's going to result in like a shutdown for the next 90 days. This will impact LNG exports, so that's negative for EMEA, but from the North America perspective, 2 BCF per day will remain. Storage levels significantly low, 14.5% below our 5-year average. We expected to go into winter at about 10.5% below with this Fremont issue, which will keep 2 BCF per day of natural gas in the US. It's now projected to be about 6.5%. But bottom line, we see continued pressures for pricing to remain at or above where it is over the next 6 to 9 months. And with that, I'll quickly turn it to Adam for transportation update.
Thanks, Myron. My name is Adam Galliers. I'm the Vice President of Logistics. I have been with Greif for 20 years now. Actually 19 years, 363 days. My 20-year anniversary is Friday, so there's some specificity for you. Just quick touch on the global ocean trends. We're seeing capacity remains tight globally. Demand continues to outpace supply. One of the most important facts is schedule reliability is at an all-time low. So I'm sure everyone that's shipped on an ocean container over the last 2 years, you've been bounced a day, a week, a month. Schedule reliability is just a mess across the globe. Last 2 quarters, we've seen a bit of price decline. Some of that is with the Shanghai port shutting down due to COVID measures, but we expect just global pricing to creep back up over the remainder of the year. I'll touch on North America next for some domestic road transportation. As you can see, contract pricing is up 15 to 20% year over year. The spot market has actually has slowed considerably over the last 90 days. So even though diesel pricing is up 70%, the overall spot market pricing has begun to decrease. That's putting a bit of pressure on contract pricing. We're still seeing quite a few contract carriers come with increased pricing, but the spot market is starting to cap that. What we'll see with if the spot market remains depressed for long term, you'll see a lot of smaller carriers go out of business. So 2021 saw a record number of small carriers enter the transportation space in the United States, mainly because prices were through the roof and everyone was coming to get that $3-4 a mile freight. But if the spot market remains low, diesel fuel remains high, you'll see kind of that perfect storm of capacity exiting the market. And then quickly touch on EMEA trends. Same story here, diesel price through the roof, driver wages have increased, very tight on capacity, and we expect the pricing for the remainder of 22 will remain elevated. Driver shortages, equipment costs, again, very, very high across the board, and diesel continues to go up week over week. So with that, I know a quick update on transportation, but as everyone touched on earlier, pretty volatile market with increased cost pressures. I'll turn it over to Roy McAdoo to close out the call.
Hi, thank you, Adam. So essentially, you've heard the view of all the main commodities, right through transport, energy, steel, and resin, and the components. So in some countries, in some regions, it's a more stable view. But the fundamentals and some of the drivers that cause some of the issues that we've seen over the last 2 years are still there. So we've still got issues on transport, as Adam said. Energy is still high. Demand is low in certain end markets. We all know about the issues with automotive and the chips. That is still there. And obviously the shutdown in Shanghai due to COVID has impacted the freight options out of there, which will have some impact in terms of the delivery of the chips. But essentially, I think the message to wrap up this webinar is 3 points, which were brought up at the last one as well. So communications are key. They continue to be key, even though there is some more stability in the market in terms of some of the supply chains. We still need to keep that dialogue going with you, our customers. We will continue to supply the latest information and the latest views we have from the market. But as you can tell, it's still very complicated, and there's still a lot of moving parts that makes it very difficult to predict where the various markets will go over the next 3 to 6 months. What will help is as accurate or as detailed forecasts as you were able to provide us for the different end markets, because that will give us some indication in terms of is the demand going down? Are we heading towards slowdowns in certain sectors, or do you see an uptick in demand due to stocks being run down? This is very important in terms of trying to plan. It's particularly if we're buying in steel or resin or other raw materials from outside the region that we do the business in. So I would ask that we continue to get those forecasts and we continue to exchange that information, because it's key in terms of managing the supply chain. So even though things look more stable now, it could be a very different picture again by the time we get to Q4 after the summer period. And what you will get from our side is the commitment from our side in terms of providing the most up-to-date information and keeping you informed as best we can in terms of where we see the markets going. We'd like the commitment from your side as well to keep us informed in terms of changes that you are seeing in the market, so that we can best continue to service and supply the various end markets that we are responsible for. With that, I will wrap up this raw material webinar. If there are any questions that were asked, I know there were a few, we'll try and deal with those offline because I'm conscious of the time. But thank you very much, and I'll have a good rest of the day for everybody on the call. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for sticking with us as we're at the top of the hour. I'm going to launch a couple of polling questions. If you can stick around to take those, we would appreciate it. And we invite you to follow us on Greif, on LinkedIn and other social media to understand when our next webinars are going to be, and stay in touch with your account manager. We'll make sure that we get you updates as we go through this process. So first, we've got the webinar. We'd like to know what you want to see for future webinars. So if you could vote that real quickly, and then I'll launch if you're looking for a Greif representative to contact you. We'll put that poll up. I'll give this one another couple of seconds. Okay, and then we'll put up the next poll. Just let us know if you would like a Greif representative to contact you. And just click on the yes, and we'll make sure that we have an account manager follow up with you if you have any questions. And as Roy said, if there's any questions that we didn't address in the Q&A, we had a lot of information to cover. So I hope you found that valuable. We'll make sure we reach out to you separately to address any of those questions that were unanswered. So again, thank you from all of us at Greif. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.